In an age when power is measured by armed guards and designer suits, the most powerful man in Burkina Faso was about to be humiliated simply because he wore a hoodie and had dark skin. What the flight attendant couldn't possibly know, this ordinary African in casual clothes wasn't just another passenger. He was President Ibrahim Traoré, and her impulsive decision would trigger an international diplomatic incident that would forever transform the relationship between Europe and Africa. The first rays of dawn painted the Charles de Gaulle airport in hues of gold and amber. The terminal's polished floors reflected the soft morning light, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the otherwise sterile environment. The air carried that distinctive blend of coffee, sanitizer, and the subtle perfume of duty-free shops, the universal scent of international travel. Among the scattered passengers waiting near Gate 37, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone on a bench, scrolling through his phone, a small leather bracelet from Bobo Dioulasso, his childhood village, encircling his wrist. Ibrahim carried nothing that signaled his importance. No Swiss watch worth a rural teacher's annual salary. No armed security creating an artificial bubble of safety. No tailored suit to separate him from ordinary citizens. To casual observers, he appeared to be just another African traveler, perhaps a businessman, an academic, or a visitor returning home after seeing family. But appearances can be supremely deceptive. This unassuming man was President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, one of West Africa's most influential leaders, a man who had stood against foreign mining companies attempting to exploit his country's gold reserves, who had restructured trade agreements to favor African farmers, and who had become a symbol of the continent's new leadership philosophy. His understated presence wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate strategy. A leader who only sees his country through tinted windows and palace walls is no leader at all, he had told his cabinet during his inauguration, much to the dismay of security officials who struggled to protect a president determined to remain accessible. He had just concluded a series of critical diplomatic meetings across Europe, negotiating new terms for resource management and sovereignty. For days, he had sat in opulent chambers, facing patronizing smiles and thinly veiled colonial attitudes from European officials who still saw African nations as economic vassals rather than equal partners. The discussions had been productive but exhausting, mental chess matches where every word carried weight. Now all Ibrahim wanted was to return to Ouagadougou, to feel the distinctive red earth beneath his feet again, to breathe the familiar air scented with neem trees and spice markets, and to continue building the independent nation that was his life's purpose. As the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Ibrahim gathered his modest carry-on bag and joined the queue forming at the gate. Inside his pocket, he carried a small piece of kola nut, a traditional symbol of respect and friendship in West Africa, a reminder of who he was serving and why. When he reached the Air France staff member checking boarding passes, he offered a genuine smile along with his documents. "Bonjour, ça va?" he asked in the flawless French that colonial history had made part of his country's heritage. The young gate agent returned his smile automatically, her eyes never registering the significance of the man before her. "Bien, merci," she replied, scanning his boarding pass and waving him through with the same mechanical courtesy extended to hundreds of others. That was precisely how Ibrahim preferred these interactions, authentic, unfiltered by title or protocol. He boarded the aircraft quietly, nodding politely to the flight attendants who greeted passengers at the door. Finding his assigned seat in business class, 2A, a window position, he settled in, placed his small bag in the overhead compartment, and prepared for the journey home. Through the window, the sprawling infrastructure of Paris stretched toward the horizon, grand and imposing, built in part with wealth extracted from nations like his own. The irony wasn't lost on him. Today he was returning home with small victories, renegotiated mining rights that would keep more gold profits within Burkina Faso's economy and educational partnerships that wouldn't require sending the brightest students abroad, never to return. Several rows behind him, a different scene was unfolding, one that would transform this routine flight into an international parable about power, prejudice, and the changing world order. "This is absolutely unacceptable." The voice cut through the ambient noise of boarding passengers like a knife. "Do you have any idea who I am or what my company provides to your airline?" Near the boarding gate, a distinguished-looking European man in his early 60s was expressing unmistakable displeasure. His tailored Brioni suit, Patek Philippe watch, and perfectly polished Salvatore Ferragamo shoes marked him as someone accustomed to luxury and deference. This was Philippe Mercier, Chief Executive Officer of Électricité Française Internationale, a corporation with tentacle-like investments across resource-rich nations throughout West Africa. The gate agents exchanged uncomfortable glances, their crimson lips stretched into strained smiles as they faced a familiar scenario. An entitled passenger whose wealth had convinced him that no was a word that applied only to others. "I apologize, Monsieur Mercier," the senior gate agent explained carefully, her voice deliberately lowered to minimize the public spectacle. "Business class is completely booked for this flight. Perhaps on your return—" "Let me be perfectly clear," Mercier interrupted, tapping his Italian leather briefcase impatiently against the polished floor. "My company's partnership agreement with Air France specifically includes premium accommodation. Find a solution, immediately." His personal assistants, a young man and woman both dressed in understated dark suits, stood nearby looking simultaneously embarrassed and resigned. Their tense postures suggested this was standard behavior from their employer, particularly when traveling to African destinations, where he expected to be treated as a visiting dignitary rather than a mere passenger. After a hushed phone conversation, a tall blonde woman in her 40s appeared, her Air France uniform worn with military precision. "Claire Desmarais, Senior Cabin Director," her name badge announced in silver lettering against navy blue. With practiced efficiency, she approached Mercier, her professional smile calibrated to convey both authority and appeasement. "Monsieur Mercier, I understand the situation. Please allow me to personally handle this matter. If you'll board now, I'll ensure appropriate arrangements are made." The magic words had been spoken, the promise of special treatment, the acknowledgement of his perceived importance. Mercier's expression softened marginally as he straightened his silk tie. "Very well. I expect this to be resolved promptly." Once on board, Claire surveyed the business-class cabin with calculating precision. Her gaze wasn't searching randomly. It was hunting for a specific type of passenger, someone dispensable, someone who wouldn't cause problems. Her eyes methodically assessed each occupant, based on an internal hierarchy of worth that had been forged through years of serving the privileged and powerful. Her scan halted momentarily when she noticed Ibrahim in seat 2A. She observed his casual clothing, the simple hoodie that retail workers might wear on weekends. She noted his hands, strong without the manicured nails of corporate executives. She registered his calm demeanor, his lack of demanding behavior, his dark complexion. Most importantly, she noted the absence of what she considered markers of importance. No designer accessories, no impatient gestures summoning flight attendants, no loud phone conversations establishing significance. She leaned toward another flight attendant, speaking in rapid French. Probably a mistake or an upgrade. Perfect candidate for relocation. With a mechanical smile fixed firmly in place, Claire approached Ibrahim's seat. "Excuse me, monsieur," she said with practiced politeness, barely concealing her presumption. "May I verify your boarding pass, please?" Ibrahim looked up from his phone where he had been reviewing notes on a new agricultural initiative. He nodded cordially and handed over his documentation without question or complaint. Claire examined the boarding pass, her expression shifting subtly as she confirmed that yes, technically, this man was assigned to this premium seat. But something in her demeanor suggested she found this information incompatible with her worldview. "Thank you," she said flatly, returning the boarding pass before retreating to confer with colleagues at the front of the cabin. Through the partially drawn curtain, Ibrahim could see her gesturing animatedly, occasionally glancing in his direction. He had encountered this behavior countless times before, in Swiss hotels, London restaurants, Berlin conference rooms. The perpetual questioning of his belonging, the assumption that his presence in premium spaces must be some kind of administrative error. Before becoming president, he had been a respected economist with degrees from Sorbonne and Oxford, yet still faced the same scrutiny in professional settings. The difference now was that he understood these moments as symptoms of a deeper global illness, one he was committed to addressing systematically rather than through individual confrontation. Minutes later, as the final passengers were boarding, Claire returned. This time her smile seemed even more artificial, stretched tight across her face like poorly applied veneer. "Sir," she began, her tone simultaneously condescending and falsely apologetic, "we have an unexpected VIP situation with our seating arrangements. We need to accommodate a priority passenger, and I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to relocate to the economy section. The airline will naturally provide appropriate compensation for the inconvenience, perhaps some air miles or a discount voucher for future travel. There it was, the insult, delivered with a veneer of professional courtesy, but transparent in its true nature. The unspoken assessment: you don't belong here. Your comfort is expendable. Your dignity is negotiable. Ibrahim Traoré raised a single eyebrow, his expression remaining composed despite the clear affront. Years of diplomatic negotiations had taught him to recognize pivotal moments disguised as minor interactions. "And may I ask," he inquired, his voice calm and precisely modulated, "why I specifically have been selected for relocation when there are dozens of other passengers in this cabin?" The question hung in the air between them, direct but not aggressive, inquisitive rather than accusatory. Claire's smile flickered momentarily as she realized this easy target might not be so easy after all. "No specific reason, sir. Just a necessary adjustment for an important guest." "An important guest," Ibrahim repeated thoughtfully. "More important than myself?" Around them, the atmosphere in the business class cabin had subtly shifted. A distinguished gentleman lowered his Financial Times newspaper. A woman in a corporate suit paused her laptop typing. The transparent injustice unfolding had begun to penetrate the bubble of privileged indifference that typically insulated such spaces. With quiet dignity, Ibrahim straightened slightly in his seat and said simply, "No, I will remain in my assigned seat, for which I have a valid ticket." Claire appeared genuinely stunned by this response. Her professional algorithm had clearly predicted compliance, especially from an African passenger who might fear causing a scene in a European setting. Ibrahim's calm refusal disrupted her entire expectation framework. "Sir," she pressed, her tone growing noticeably colder, "I must insist. This is necessary for operational reasons." Ibrahim met her gaze directly. His eyes carried a depth that momentarily unsettled her. They weren't the eyes of someone intimidated by authority, but rather someone intimately familiar with its genuine form. "If this is truly an operational necessity," he responded evenly, "then please explain why I have been specifically selected while other business-class passengers remain undisturbed. Or is it perhaps more accurate to say, this is a preferential decision rather than an operational one?" Claire hesitated visibly. She had not anticipated being asked to justify what was essentially an arbitrary and discriminatory selection process. Around them, the subtle sounds of the cabin, rustling newspapers, typing fingers, hushed conversations, had diminished as passengers became unwitting witnesses to this quiet confrontation. Meanwhile, Mercier remained at the boarding gate, impatiently awaiting confirmation that a premium seat had been secured for him. Claire retreated hastily to the front of the aircraft, conferred with the captain in hushed tones, then emerged with renewed determination. What happened next revealed the true nature of the situation with painful clarity. Rather than accepting Ibrahim's legitimate refusal, Claire began a systematic approach to other passengers, but not just any passengers. She specifically targeted other travelers of African descent in the business class section, approaching them one by one with the same relocation request. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply disturbing. Ibrahim observed this behavior with outward calm, though internally he was documenting every detail with the precise attention of someone who understood that history often pivots on seemingly small moments of injustice. This wasn't merely about his personal dignity. It represented a systemic issue that affected countless travelers who lacked his position and influence to resist such treatment. When Claire approached a young African man several rows behind, perhaps in his late 20s, dressed smartly in business casual attire, the situation reached its breaking point. The young man appeared confused as Claire gestured toward his seat. "You, sir. We need you to relocate to economy," she stated with thinly disguised impatience. "May I ask why?" the young man inquired, reasonable confusion evident in his voice. Claire offered no explanation, simply held out her hand for his boarding pass with an expression that suggested his compliance was expected without question. That was the moment Ibrahim Traoré decided the time for silent observation had ended. He rose from his seat with deliberate calmness, his movement drawing all eyes in the cabin. Standing at his full height, there was something undeniably commanding about his presence despite his casual attire. "Enough," he stated, his voice quiet, yet carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "You are systematically selecting passengers based on appearance rather than any legitimate criteria. This constitutes discrimination, and it must stop immediately." Claire turned toward him, visibly rattled by his intervention. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to sit down and not create disturbances. This is a routine seating adjustment." "There is nothing routine about targeting only passengers of African descent," Ibrahim replied, his words measured but direct. "I've observed your pattern of selection. It appears that in your assessment, some of us are less deserving of the seats we've rightfully purchased." For just a moment, Claire fixed him with a stare that was meant to intimidate, but instead encountered something unexpected, an immovable certainty, a natural authority that transcended artificial hierarchies. She felt a momentary chill at the realization that she had misjudged something significant about this passenger, though she still had no idea who exactly stood before her. To her, he remained categorized as simply another troublesome passenger, an inconvenience to be managed. She walked away with poorly concealed irritation, muttering under her breath in French, "Ces gens-là toujours à faire des histoires." These people, always making problems. She did not realize that Ibrahim Traoré not only understood every word perfectly, but had spent years negotiating in French with diplomats and business leaders who similarly underestimated him until it was too late. Mercier was finally permitted to board, greeted by Claire with exaggerated courtesy that contrasted sharply with her treatment of other passengers. "We're resolving the seating situation, monsieur," she assured him, offering a complimentary glass of champagne before the aircraft had even left the gate, a special accommodation rarely provided even in business class. "I should hope so," Mercier replied loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Some people don't understand that efficient business operations require appropriate prioritization." Through it all, Ibrahim merely returned to his seat, fastened his seatbelt, and maintained his characteristic composure. His fingers occasionally touched the small cola nut in his pocket, a grounding reminder of home and purpose amidst this display of lingering colonial mentality. He wasn't angry. He was strategically patient, like a chess master who had already visualized the endgame while his opponent was still moving pawns. The aircraft taxied down the runway and lifted into the morning sky, leaving French territory behind, but carrying within its pressurized cabin a situation that would soon escalate into an international incident with far-reaching consequences. The landscape below transformed from European infrastructure to the Mediterranean Sea, then gradually to the distinctive topography of North Africa, before finally approaching the red earth beauty of Burkina Faso. Throughout the flight, Claire maintained a noticeable distance from Ibrahim, though something about his composed presence clearly unsettled her. Midway through the journey, professional obligation compelled her to approach his seat again. "Would you care for something to drink, sir?" she asked, her smile thin and perfunctory. Ibrahim glanced up at her briefly. "Water would be fine, thank you." She nodded curtly and moved away quickly, providing the requested beverage without the customary napkin or courtesy words, just the bare minimum of service obligation fulfilled. By contrast, her attentiveness to Mercier was almost theatrical, laughing appreciatively at his anecdotes, leaning in with apparent fascination when he spoke, and inquiring with seeming interest about his business ventures. From his privileged position, Mercier expounded loudly, "Burkina Faso is fortunate to have our investments. We're bringing much-needed structure and expertise to regions that desperately require modernization. Without European involvement, these places would struggle to develop basic infrastructure." Claire nodded in enthusiastic agreement, completely unaware that the democratically elected leader of that very nation was seated just 2 rows away, listening to every presumptuous word, while mentally calculating how many schools could be built with the tax revenues his recent negotiations would secure. A woman seated nearby, later identified as Dr. Aisha Sankara, a renowned Burkinabe surgeon returning home after a medical conference in Paris, observed the entire situation with growing indignation. She recognized President Traoré immediately, but respected his apparent desire to remain anonymous. Leaning toward her colleague, she whispered, "That's our president they're disrespecting so blatantly. They have no idea who they're humiliating." Her companion's eyes widened in disbelief, but both maintained their silence. The president clearly had his reasons for traveling incognito, and neither wished to compromise whatever purpose guided his unusual approach to international travel. As the aircraft began its descent toward Ouagadougou International Airport, the cabin atmosphere shifted to the familiar preparations for landing. The captain's voice announced their approach in both French and English, mentioning the local time and weather, 38 degrees, typical for the season. Passengers straightened their seats, stowed their belongings, and fastened their seatbelts in preparation for arrival. Through the windows, passengers could see the landscape of Burkina Faso coming into view, the golden sunlight illuminating the distinctive red soil, the sprawling city gradually taking shape as they descended. What none of the passengers could yet discern was the unusual activity unfolding on the airport grounds below. A substantial convoy had assembled on the tarmac, a formation of black governmental SUVs, military vehicles with the Burkinabe insignia, and a formal presidential escort standing at attention in precise rows. The soldiers wore the distinctive tan uniforms of the Presidential Guard, their red berets signifying their elite status within the military hierarchy. Within the cabin, whispers of curiosity began circulating as passengers caught glimpses of this unexpected reception through their windows. "Are those soldiers?" one European businessman asked with noticeable nervousness. "Is there some kind of situation happening?" "No, no," another passenger replied reassuringly. "That appears to be standard protocol for a visiting dignitary." "Perhaps someone important is arriving on our flight," a third passenger suggested. Mercier overheard these comments and allowed himself a self-satisfied smile. Leaning toward Claire, who was checking seatbelts in his row, he remarked with unmistakable smugness, "They must have prepared a suitable welcome for me. My company's investments are quite significant to their economy." Claire laughed appreciatively at this assessment, already mentally preparing to escort this important client personally to the terminal ahead of other passengers, a courtesy she had decided to extend without consulting airline protocols. The aircraft completed its landing, the wheels making contact with Burkinabe soil as the engines reversed, thrust with a roar. As they taxied toward the terminal, the impressive array of presidential guards became clearly visible, standing in perfect formation, their weapons held in ceremonial position. Behind this military honor guard stood several distinguished individuals in formal attire: the Minister of Defense, the Foreign Minister, the Head of National Security, and other cabinet members, all waiting patiently under the hot African sun. Claire peered out a nearby window, her expression shifting to one of confusion tinged with alarm. "What on earth is this about?" she whispered to another flight attendant. Mercier rose from his seat prematurely, adjusting his tie and smoothing his expensive suit jacket with confident motions. "As I said, this reception is clearly for me. I mentioned my company is involved in several major infrastructure projects here." But before the aircraft door could even be opened, an unexpected development silenced every conversation in the cabin. A tall, commanding officer wearing the distinctive red beret of Burkina Faso's elite presidential guard boarded the aircraft. His polished boots made a distinctive sound against the floor as he proceeded deliberately down the aisle, his eyes scanning each face methodically. When he reached seat 2A, he halted sharply and raised his right hand in a crisp, perfect military salute. "Monsieur le Président," he announced formally, his voice carrying throughout the suddenly silent cabin. "Welcome home, Your Excellency." The effect of these words was electric. A collective gasp seemed to rise from the assembled passengers as understanding dawned. Claire's face transformed in an instant, color draining visibly as her eyes darted between the officer and the man she had treated with such dismissive condescension throughout the flight. Her hands began to tremble noticeably as the implications of her behavior became horrifyingly clear. Ibrahim Traoré rose unhurriedly from his seat, his demeanor as calm and measured as it had been throughout the journey. He acknowledged the officer with a slight nod. Not smug, not triumphant, simply a man whose true position had finally been revealed through no action of his own. Mercier had frozen in place, his earlier confidence evaporating as rapidly as morning dew under the African sun. President, he stammered, his voice barely audible. "That man is—" President Traoré turned slightly and acknowledged the CEO with another simple nod, his expression neither angry nor vengeful, just the steady gaze of a leader who no longer needed words to establish his authority. A second officer boarded the aircraft and approached Claire and Mercier directly. "We have specific instructions," he announced, his tone professional but unmistakably severe. "You two will both accompany us immediately." "Wait, what? Why me?" Claire protested, her voice rising with sudden anxiety. "There must be some misunderstanding." "You are being temporarily detained for questioning," the officer stated firmly. "The public disrespect shown to our head of state on sovereign Burkinabe territory constitutes a serious offense under our laws." Claire attempted a nervous laugh, looking around desperately for support from colleagues or passengers. No, this can't be right. I was simply performing my professional duties. There's been a misunderstanding." But her protests found no receptive audience. The facts had been observed by too many witnesses, the pattern of discrimination too obvious to dismiss. President Ibrahim Traoré disembarked from the aircraft and was immediately received by his government officials, military leaders, and security detail. Beyond the airport perimeter fence, a crowd of citizens had gathered. Having heard through rapid social media posts that their president was returning under unusual circumstances, their cheers carried across the tarmac as cameras captured a moment that would soon be transmitted around the world. Meanwhile, Claire and Mercier were being escorted away, their former arrogance completely dissolved. Fellow passengers watched in stunned silence as they were led down the stairs, their heads bowed low, no longer the powerful figures they had presented themselves to be just minutes earlier. The blazing African sun beat down on the tarmac as all attention focused on the two individuals being led towards separate black government vehicles, now flanked by elite presidential guards. The officers maintained professional silence, no taunting, no unnecessary force, just the quiet execution of their duty with appropriate gravity. Inside the terminal building, President Ibrahim Traoré addressed a hastily assembled press contingent. His statement was characteristically concise, delivered without raised voice or visible anger, yet carrying undeniable moral weight. "In Burkina Faso," he stated clearly, "we do not evaluate a person's worth based on skin color or appearance. We reject the lingering colonial mindset that assumes European superiority. Here we stand for human dignity, mutual respect, and the sovereignty of our people. This is the essence of the new Africa we are building together, one where historical power imbalances no longer determine who deserves respect and who does not." The incident spread through global media channels with astonishing speed. Smartphone footage captured by passengers began circulating online within hours, clips showing the discrimination, the military boarding, the moment of revelation when the president's identity became known. Social media platforms exploded with commentary. Hashtags like Respect Africa and Burkina Rising trending globally as African youth across the continent celebrated what many viewed as a symbolic moment of accountability. At the Ministry of Justice, both Claire and Mercier faced formal charges: public disrespect toward a head of state, discriminatory behavior on Burkinabe sovereign territory, abuse of authority, and attempted coercion. The French embassy in Ouagadougou immediately launched intensive diplomatic efforts to intervene, with calls placed at the highest levels of government and formal requests for special consideration. President Traoré's response to these diplomatic pressures was characteristically straightforward. "Burkina Faso is not a colony. We are a sovereign nation with established laws. These individuals will receive fair treatment under our judicial system, exactly as any citizen would. No more, no less." Meanwhile, Air France corporate headquarters confronted a rapidly escalating public relations crisis. Within 24 hours, the airline released an official statement, a carefully crafted document full of corporate language expressing regret for any misunderstanding that may have occurred, while avoiding direct acknowledgement of the discriminatory behavior demonstrated by their employee. The response was widely criticized as insufficient. Citizens across Africa began organizing a boycott of the airline, a movement that quickly gained support across multiple nations where similar experiences of discrimination in international travel were all too familiar. Claire, now held in a detention facility outside Ouagadougou, pending formal legal proceedings, reportedly broke down during initial questioning. "I had no idea who he was," she explained through tears. "I was simply following what I thought were appropriate procedures." The investigator's response was pointed and profound. His identity should have been irrelevant. Basic human dignity and equal treatment are not privileges reserved for those with recognizable names or titles. The CEO, facing potential legal consequences in both Burkina Faso and France as his company's stock value, plummeted amid the controversy, attempted to leverage his considerable influence to secure preferential treatment. However, the Burkinabe judiciary issued a precedent-setting ruling that emphasized a fundamental principle: there can be no immunity based on economic status, no special treatment based on nationality. Justice must operate equally for all who enter our sovereign territory. Throughout the unfolding events, President Ibrahim Traoré never engaged in triumphalism or public mockery of those who had mistreated him. He simply returned to the presidential palace and resumed his governance responsibilities, overseeing infrastructure development, implementing youth empowerment programs, strengthening national security, and protecting the country's natural resources. 1 year later, a new international protocol was adopted by major airlines worldwide, specifically addressing equitable treatment of all passengers regardless of perceived status or origin. It became known informally as the Traoré Standard, a recognition that dignity is not determined by title but inherent in humanity itself. The incident aboard that Air France flight transcended its immediate circumstances to become something approaching modern folklore, a powerful narrative about quiet dignity confronting entrenched prejudice, about a humble leader in casual attire, about the changing balance of global power, and about a landing that ultimately changed perspectives far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. In the presidential office in Ouagadougou, a small framed photo now sits on Ibrahim Traoré's desk, not of the dramatic airport arrest that made international headlines, but of the simple cola nut he had carried in his pocket that day. Below it, a proverb in Mooré, the indigenous language of his childhood village: "True power speaks quietly, but truth echoes forever."